So I actually gave this course back in 2011 here. I was thinking I could just use the same deck, but actually I don't think any of the slides have survived through to this deck. So some of you will be pleased to hear that. A lot has changed. So what I wanted to do, though, I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about the motivation from historically for moving from magstripe.
Could you please use the microphone?
Sorry?
Could you please use the microphone?
Yeah.
It should be on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. For moving from magstripe to chip. And by chip, I mean the little gold-plated or silver-plated contact on your plastic credit card or debit card. And I should probably explain what EMV is, or right at the beginning. EMV is the standards group that develops and maintains the specifications for these chip cards. So the commands and responses, the interface between the card and the terminal, and also the security mechanisms that are used. So in fact, most of today's presentation is going to be talking about EMV chip, although in the last 10 years, the scope of EMV has actually broadened beyond that, and now covers not just contact chip cards, but contactless cards, mobile phones, and remote commerce. And I'll tell you a bit about that also in the second half of the presentation. But first of all, some, should we say, motivation for why moving to chip in the first place. So historically, credit cards, debit cards use a mag stripe. A mag stripe is still in use. All of your cards will probably still have a mag stripe on them, partly for backwards compatibility, but some countries around the world still don't have chip, and I'll show you some deployment figures and statistics on that later. But it's a very old technology. It's basically encodes, the mag stripe encodes your card account number. And it didn't take very long for fraudsters to realize that they could create their own mag stripe just by taking, well, they could actually create valid looking account numbers that would be accepted by merchants. The only trick would be to generate the correct LUN check digit on the end of the account number. But that wasn't exactly rocket science. So the solution to that, from a security perspective, was to have a cryptogram encoded into the mag stripe. So in Mastercard, we call this a CVC1. Visa calls it CVV1. And I think Amex has another three-letter acronym. There are lots of different three-letter acronyms, often meaning the same things in my industry. Apologies for that. In fact, that's one useful thing about having the EMV standard, is that it actually, where possible, it actually means that we have the same language that all the different credit card schemes use. So CVC1 is only 3 digits. It's basically generated by the issuer of the card encrypting the card number and expiry date, and then truncating the result of that to 3 digits. So very basic, but it does the trick insofar as you can't just randomly create a mag stripe that would pass a CVC1 check by the issuer. The fraudsters are forced, of course, to skim the data at source, and that became very prevalent, and still actually is prevalent, and it completely circumvents the value or the benefit of having CVC1, and so the only way to move from there is to actually have a chip cards where the chip actually has a secret key in it, and it can dynamically create different cryptograms for each and every transaction. So just to give you a picture of what the fraud landscape looked like back in the year 2000. So this is in the UK. I believe Belgium actually went and used chip for card payments before the UK. The UK and in particular France, were particularly different, in fact, because they didn't have much online connectivity for their transactions. So the idea of having a chip, and especially a chip which could authenticate itself to the terminal, was very attractive. But if you just look at the counterfeit figures there, the mauve portion of the pie there is over a third of all fraud, and of that, most of it is skimming. So there's a significant amount of fraud from counterfeit, and that's magstripe counterfeit, and also of lost and stolen, because certainly in the UK, transactions were all handwritten signature verified. There was no PIN at point of sale. So that was a very good reason to move to chip. And just looking back, actually pre-magstripe, there were originally, in fact, the plastic card was actually often used as a check guarantee card. So it's interesting to think here you actually have sort of a dual factor or approach of having a check, paper check, and also a check guarantee plastic card with a copy of your signature on it. Then gradually new techniques were put into place to secure the plastic cards. So you had card embossing, then you had the magstripe, then you have hologram also included, and then you have the CVC1, which I mentioned. And I should probably mention also that as well as putting a 3-digit CVC1 into the magstripe, at the same time as that, issuers were putting CVC2 onto the signature panel of the card. So that is for remote commerce, mail order, telephone order transactions. So that CVC technology benefited both face-to-face transactions and remote commerce or e-commerce. And then finally, there's chip. So looking at the fraud statistics in the period between 2000 and 2010, you can see that there's a dramatic decrease in, well, I was going to say, there's certainly a decrease in the lost and stolen. It's the green line. The picture for counterfeit was slightly more haphazard, although it did finally drop right down in 2010. One of the reasons why it spiked here in 2008 was because it was being, again, this is UK fraud, the chip cards were being used in retailers, and especially in particular in petrol stations. The PIN was being captured because the terminals had been tampered with. So they were capturing the pins. They were also capturing the chip data. And unfortunately, the chip data had a complete copy of the magstripe details in them. So when the fraudsters tampered with the terminal and obtained the PIN, they also got a copy of the magstripe from the chip data. That shouldn't have happened. The problem there was that the CVC1 on the magstripe was copied bit for bit onto the chip, into the chip data. What should have happened is that there should have been a completely separate CVC in what's called the track 2 equivalent data in the chip. So that's the magstripe copy. So we'll come back later actually to talk about tampering with terminals, but to cut a long story short, when this fraud was detected, it was very quickly stopped. But at the time it was quite, I would say, quite embarrassing to the industry. Also during that time we see remote commerce, card not present fraud increasing dramatically. It came actually under control briefly with the advent of things like Mastercard secure code and verified by Visa. So that's where you have the opportunity to use a password to authenticate yourself to the issuing bank as part of the transaction, or to use indeed CVC2. But if you look over here on the right-hand side at last year's figures, you see although that counterfeit and lost and stolen are relatively under control, card not present is way up there. Bearing in mind, of course, that part of this is the fact that the sheer volume of e-commerce transactions has increased so dramatically over the last 10 years. It's not surprising that the fraud would be increasing at the same time because of that. But there are moves afoot to stop this high level of card not present fraud, and I'll talk briefly about that. The other thing that's quite interesting, I suppose, here about the lost and stolen fraud is it's back up to 95 million in the UK, and this apparently is to do with very basic attacks. They're not technical attacks. They're stealing the card and after having observed you entering your PIN in the supermarket, for example. They're relatively basic social engineering type attacks to steal cards and then use them. So risk management. So if we have chips which solve a lot of the problems, it's not just the crypto that helps reduce the fraud. On the terminal side, there's quite a lot of useful fraud detection and fraud limitation that can be performed. So you can send the transaction randomly online, or 1 in every 10, 1 in every 5. And there's also something called the merchant floor limit, which isn't actually chip related, but it basically says that if the transaction is, say, over $30 or 30 euros, then the transaction will be always sent online to the issuer. And if you don't send it online to the issuer, then it's merchant, it's your liability, it's your risk. With magstripe, the floor limits used to be $50, $100. Now with magstripe, the floor limits are 0. So all magstripe transactions, if they ever happen, in Europe that's very rarely, would be sent online to the issuer with a 0 floor limit. For the card, there's quite a lot of interesting things that can be programmed into the card. And in particular, you can have counters and limits programmed into the card, so that, for example, if you have a particular spending limits, you can program what's called a lower limit and an upper limit on the total amount spent. So that when the total amount spent has gone higher than the lower limit, then the transaction will the card will try and send the transaction online. But then if the cumulative amount goes above a higher threshold, then it will refuse to do a transaction offline until it goes online. And once it's gone online to the issuer, then the counters can be reset and you start over again. So that's quite a powerful mechanism to make sure that you don't have a runaway fraud on a stolen card. You can force the transaction to go online. And in fact, there's something called the Payment Services Directive, PSD2, which is a regulation that's coming out. It's going to be enforced from September this year. It's a European regulation, and it requires that these kinds of techniques be used, not just for face-to-face transactions, but also for e-commerce transactions. So, as well as having counters and the card risk management, and by the way, just having a transaction counter in the chip card is very helpful from a fraud detection perspective, because clearly if an issuer sees 2 transactions coming in from the same card with different cryptograms, but the transaction numbers are different, are the same, then clearly something is very wrong, because the transaction counters should always be different. It's always incrementing in a monotonic fashion. So you can have secret keys in the card. They can be symmetric keys, typically triple DES or AES, well, not so typically AES, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. If they're symmetric keys, then they can only be used between the card and the issuer. However, if you use public key cryptography, then you could actually have the terminal authenticating the card as well. If the terminal has a copy of the correct public key, then it can authenticate the card. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And finally, of course, if you want to do offline PIN verification, that's where the PIN is entered at the point of sale, but not sent online up to the issuing bank, but rather sent locally to the chip card. Then if the chip card has a copy of the reference PIN, it will be able to validate the transaction PIN. But that means then that the card will now be storing a copy of the reference PIN, which is obviously needs to be protected very carefully. In fact, there's a whole lot of stuff, as we saw this morning, that needs to be protected, because not only can you store secret cryptographic keys in these chip cards, but you've got to be able to protect them against things like side channel attacks. And there's a whole heap of stuff that goes on in order to ensure that these keys and the pins are protected. I'm not going to go through this slide verbatim. I know you had a lot of information on this type of thing this morning, and you've got some more tomorrow on side channel attacks. But the whole life cycle basically of the chip, from design right the way through to issuance to the consumer. I mean, at the end of the day, the consumer just wants to buy stuff. They don't want to know about all of the security. But the security is all there in the background. And one of the reasons, in fact, for establishing EMV was to do the security evaluation of the chip cards. So not only does EMV Co. develop and maintain the specifications for how a chip card will talk to a terminal, but also it manages the security evaluation of the chip cards themselves to make sure that they're up to the job. As far as the specifications are concerned, there are 4 books, the second of which is on security and cryptography. Before explaining how the cryptography works, I'll just give you a little overview of what EMV Co. does. So EMV actually stands for Europay, Mastercard and Visa. But Europay, which I actually worked for many years ago, became part of Mastercard. In any way, it was kind of like it was Mastercard in Europe in some sense. And V stands for Visa. So that's what EMV stands for. And now, though, and that was sort of established about 20 years ago, but now the members of EMV Co. have grown. And there's also Amex, American Express, Discover, JCB, which is the Japanese card company, and China Union Pay. And EMV describes itself as being a technology toolbox for card payments. And the reason for that is that although EMV defines the interoperability specifications and some elements of the security, it's very much up to the payment systems and their customers, the banks, to actually pick which tools they want to use from that toolbox. So often, in fact, when there is an attack on EMV, so to speak, it's really not something that EMV could do anything about. EMV often has provided the tools to defend against the attack. It's just that they weren't used. And I'll show you some examples of that. So EMV started off as being just for contact chip card payments. It has moved on to include also contactless cards and mobile. When it comes to the contactless specifications, each payment system actually has their own specification for contactless, broadly based upon the contact specs. But in reality, each payment system has their own contactless specifications, and these are, in some sense, housed on the EMVCo website. You can go and find them on the EMVCo website if you look under contactless. Ditto for the other technologies, so mobile and QR codes, and something called tokenization, which I'll say a bit more about later. You can find those on the EMVCo website. And finally, for remote payments, this has happened, say, in the last 3 years, 4 years. We've got 3D Secure and more recently, Secure Remote Commerce. Well, Nigel already mentioned how the EMV PKI and the certificates is arguably the largest PKI in the world for human beings. Some of these stats go to illustrate that. It's quite interesting, I think, that if you look at the United States on the bottom of that chart, it's gone from having no EMV cards 5 years ago to having almost over 60% of their cards are now EMV, which is quite a phenomenal adoption rate. Another interesting thing I think for these stats is if you look in the second line, Asia Pacific, although we've only got, if you look, say, in this column, back in 2015 they only had a 25% adoption rate, which has now doubled to 51%. If you look at the sheer volume of cards, that is a huge number. So although they're only at 51%, that's 51% of a very large number. By the way, if any of you have any questions as we're going through this, please don't hesitate to ask. So one of the important things to understand with credit card and debit card transactions are who are the players involved. So Mastercard and the likes of Mastercard and Visa and Union Pay, Amex, etc. They are payment schemes who sit here. Mastercard, for example, is a payment scheme, but we are not a bank. We don't lend credit or we don't operate debit accounts. That would be the card issuer over here. So they issue cards to the card holder. Nowadays they could actually be digitized cards in a mobile phone, which are then used to make purchases at a merchant or to withdraw cash at an ATM. The merchants, for their side, in order to get paid, they have to have an arrangement with an acquiring bank who looks after them. And it's actually the payment scheme that liaises, so to speak, between the acquiring bank and the issuing bank in order to make sure that the payments are made, especially for an international transaction. And on the subject of international, if we wanted the card to authenticate to the merchant terminal, we're talking on an international basis, you can't really use symmetric cryptography for that. A Belgian card will not have the same symmetric keys as a Brazilian terminal. That's just not going to happen. And this is why for the local authentication, the so-called offline authentication of the card to the terminal, that uses public key cryptography, RSA. Whereas if the transaction goes online, then the issuer can authenticate the cardholder or the card by means of using secret key, symmetric key cryptography. And I'll explain how that happens in the next slide. I mentioned token service providers earlier. They could be a payment scheme, they could be another third party, and they basically enable cards to have pseudo numbers. So they don't actually have the normal account number, they have a fictitious or virtual card numbers, which is quite useful, and I'll say a bit more about that later. And there could also, in all of this, there are service providers who do things on behalf of the banks. As far as the crypto is concerned, it's used for offline card authentication to the terminal. We use RSA, and there are various flavors. There are various flavors of RSA, of card authentication. So there's SDA, DDA, or CDA, and there's offline PIN encipherment. This means that when you enter your PIN into the PIN entry device at the point of sale, it can be encrypted to the card so that it can't be eavesdropped between the terminal and the card. So that's nice. As far as the RSA is concerned, it's with message recovery. That means that a lot of the message that is signed, whether it be the certificates, the public keys in the certificates, they can actually be embedded in some sense in the signature, which saves a lot of space. And in the old days of EMV, that was very important. In fact, even today, that is still an attractive characteristic. And maximum key length, though, is effectively 2,000 bits, which in today's world seems a bit low to be a maximum. And in fact, already now we have issuers who are using the maximum length key. Cards will still typically be 1,000 bits or 1,100 bits. Normally we go up in increments of 128. So I think most cards nowadays use 1128 bit keys, 1152 bit keys. But they can gradually progress and get longer. It's the issuer keys that have now hit this top level ceiling. Moving on to the symmetric cryptography, which is used between the card and the issuer when it goes online. That uses 2 key triple DES. Again, that's a fairly limited form of cryptography. It's had a lot of reputational accusations that it's not fit for purpose anymore, although on continuing assessment we still believe it provides adequate security. So we don't see any urgency to replace it, but that said, in EMVCo we have introduced the option to use AES, so that's now also supported. But to be honest, I don't think many people are using it yet. I mentioned offline PIN encryption, so it can either be sent in plain text from the terminal to the card or encrypted, or it can go online to the issuer like you would have with an ATM transaction. That was said with a slight UK hat on, because I know actually in Belgium you for a long time have had PIN sent online to the issuer in point of sale transactions at merchants. So it's only at the likes of, I think, the UK and France and some other countries where online PIN at point of sale has not been common. In Belgium, online PIN at point of sale is quite often what's done. But for that, you have to have the secret keys in the PIN pads to do the secure sending of the PIN online to the acquiring bank and then to the issuer. So that's cardholder verification, and there's something called CD-CVM, which can be used for mobile transactions. That's about to be a fingerprint or some such on your phone. For offline CAM, I already mentioned that is using RSA, and there are 3 flavors. We normally only use DDA and CDA nowadays because SDA is static and can just be skimmed and replayed. CDA is the strongest because it's a signature generated by the card on the whole transaction data. There's this thing called the unpredictable number. It's 4 bytes, 32 bits. We believe that's adequately large to prevent, to ensure freshness of the cryptogram. I'm speeding up a little bit here because this slide doesn't have a slide number on it, but I think I'm running slightly slow. So please forgive me if I start talking a bit faster and skipping through some of the slides. So this is the largest, arguably the largest PKI in the world. And what happens is your payment scheme has a key pair, and it uses that key pair to sign an issuer key pair, and the issuer will generate for their cards card key pairs, and the issuer will then certify the card's public key. So that's exactly how you would expect it to be. Nothing really new there. And the payment scheme key, public key, is sent via the acquirer to all the terminals. So this now means that the terminals can authenticate card signatures. So that's great. On the symmetric crypto side, the issuers have top-level keys. This is the main key. That's used for verifying card MACs, message authentication codes generated by the card during the transaction. But what happens is that this issuer master key is used to derive a card master key, which is then personalized into the card before it's issued to the cardholder. And then during a transaction, what happens is that the card uses its master key to derive a session key, and it's a session key that is used for generating the MACs that is verified by the issuer. Okay, and then there are these other 2 types of keys which are used for updating card details and things like that, possibly even changing the reference pin on the card. This is a slightly complex slide, but what's going on is very simple, really. This is showing how the terminal gets a cryptogram, a MAC, from the card and optionally sends it online to the issuer, who verifies it. If you don't go online, or either way, at the end of the transaction, the card provides a TC, which is another MAC, which can be verified by the issuer subsequently. Again, there's this unpredictable number, which is, I will explain a bit more in a minute. So there's been lots of security research. I say security research. Some of these papers are fashioned more as attacks on EMV. And there's been, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of them. Some of them more serious than others. Some of them relevant to EMV, some of them not relevant really to EMV. And I'll just describe some of them on the next slide. So offline ciphered PIN, there was a spate of, I mentioned the UK fueling station attacks, which caused the spike in fraud in 2008. Well, that was partly enabled by having, or could have been caused by having these shims in the card reader. And those shims can then just passively read all of the data that's sent to and fro. And that could include the plaintext PIN. So that's a very good reason for encrypting the PIN. That said, there are, as we heard earlier, lots of ways of capturing PINs as you enter them into the keypad. You can have, the thermal resonance or audio side channels to determine what the keys are being pressed. And you can have plain shoulder surfing, CCTV cameras. There are lots of ways you can potentially get hold of pins. Some of these social engineering attacks are where I believe was where the attacker just simply asked the card holder for their pin. So man-in-the-middle attacks or wedge attacks. So this is where it's like a shim is a man in the middle in a sense, but here the man in the middle is on the card side. And this was a picture of has a real chip, legitimate chip, hiding behind this fake chip. So this is on the very top of that is a fake chip, and underneath it is the real chip. And what the fake chip does is it modifies certain things during the transaction. So for example, if the real chip is saying, no, I don't want to do this transaction, or PIN has not been verified, the fake chip can change that no to a yes, and effectively make a yes card. A lot of these researches are done, I noticed a reference to Light the Blue Touch paper in an earlier talk today. If you search there, you can find quite an interesting collection of researches, also including unpredictable numbers and pre-play attacks. So the reason why we have in the EMV protocol an unpredictable number is to make sure the cryptograms are fresh. And if those unpredictable numbers are not unpredictable, then you can have pre-play attacks. And it was found, unfortunately, that some terminals were using date stamps and counters as their unpredictable numbers, and therefore they were subject to attacks. Not good. And EMV has actually produced special guidance now on that topic, and even designed an algorithm for generating unpredictable numbers. Relay attacks, these are been known about for a very long time, and they've become increasingly easy to perform, especially with mobile phones doing the relaying. You can get apps now that actually will do the relay attacks. EMV has introduced recently a relay resistance protocol. Mastercard is implementing it on our contactless chip transactions. And the relay resistance protocol basically times how long it takes for the transaction, for a kind of ping-pong protocol to take place, rapid-fire protocol. And if it takes too long, then it's suspected that there's a relay. And you can actually also try to address relay attacks by having notifications sent to the card holder when a high-value transaction is made. So they'll see on their phone, for example, you have just done a €100 ATM withdrawal, and they'll say, no, I haven't, I just bought a cup of coffee. And that will alert them. So as time moves on, there will be defenses against things like relay attacks. Right, I'll move very quickly forward. You've all used, everyone uses contactless cards now, and I think most people think it's great. Very fast, very simple. Nigel, 5 minutes, okay. There are from time to time security concerns about them, and there are some facts, and the facts are that yes, you can read a contactless card if you're a fraudster, if you get close enough to the card. That's how they work. But then what do you do with what you've read? You shouldn't be able to use it for any fraudulent purposes, and there shouldn't be any private information. The cardholder name should not be revealed on the contactless interface. And you can't actually power up a card at a long distance. If anyone claims that you can over half a meter, then they should be brought to task and asked to show how they do it. So there's a challenge. Yes, so I've mentioned some of this already. And you can use mobiles for contact as well. So basically when you do tap your mobile phone at a point of sale, that's basically doing an EMV transaction. But also you can use mobiles not just for notifications, but for payments in remote commerce. And I'll say a bit about that in a minute. Some mobiles have a secure element for storing the keys in, some don't. Some store the keys in software. So you need to have mitigations. And this slide just mentions some of those mitigations. EMV is looking at using elliptic curve to replace or to augment RSA because of the key length restriction. I'm not going to say too much about this, but we're proposing something called blinded Diffie-Hellman, and Nigel Smart has proved it's secure. So go and read that paper reference there. It's an easy read. It took me the whole of one summer to read. I kind of felt good once I got to the end of it, but it was difficult. And this slide just tries to explain at a very high level how blinded Diffie-Hellman works. And this is a little picture showing how this second-gen elliptic curve secure channel protects against various attacks. Slightly humorous slide. EMV payment tokenization. So this is quite a clever technique. It's hugely simple, actually, when you think about it. Instead of having the same account number used for all of your transactions, you'll have a different number for different things. And especially when you look at e-commerce, if you have a different account number lodged for different merchants, then if you steal the account number from one merchant, it's not going to be usable at any other merchant because it won't be accepted. So to have a pseudo number instead of using your regular card number that's printed on the front of the card is a really simple and effective security thing. 3D secure and EMV secure remote commerce. So this is information you can get from the EMVCo website, by the way. The specs are all up there, as are some webinars and presentations. So basically, this is the EMV 3D Secure augments the previous 3D Secure by allowing in-app purchases and also allowing a simpler, frictionless, so to speak, user experience. And it uses device information on the mobile device, for example, that is then shared with the issuer, and the issuer can see, do I think this is secure? Could it be fraud? And if they think it's a bit risky, then they can do what's called step up, and that's where they actually ask for the password, or preferably not a static password, but maybe a one-time password, or some other kind of cardholder authentication. And so that would only be done on the riskier transactions. And the crypto used there for the in-app purchases are Jose RFCs on top of TLS, so that's quite double safety. We also have, I've mentioned some of this already, the strong customer authentication. So this also relates back to Payment Service Directive 2, requiring strong customer authentication. And EMVCo is working with something called the FIDO Alliance to improve the situation there. And Mastercard has a program in place called Mastercard Identity Check. And one of the possibilities there is to use one-time passcodes that are sent via SMS to the mobile phone. Some of you may already have used that approach. And then finally, EMV Secure Remote Commerce is something that's extremely recent. The specs have only just been published like a few days ago. But rather than me try and present all of what SRC is about, there is actually a special video that you can watch on the EMVCo website. So that concludes my talk. Are there any questions? I'm afraid I'm not going to be here in the tea break afterwards, so if you do have any questions, then ask them now or later.